Here with all of you today, kind of right on that those weird couple weeks towards the end of summer, but before fall really starts. And I know the temperatures are like, I don't know, heat index of 142 or something like that. And the calendar says there's still 6 weeks left of summer. But parents, kiddos, you guys are starting that back to school mode, looking at supplies, things like that. Students will be coming back to campus soon. We might have a couple of them here today, maybe checking us out for the first time or coming back. That's happening soon. So if that's you, please stop, say hello after the service. I would love to meet you. But today we kind of take a look at what might be kind of a familiar text for a lot of us, Jesus feeding the 5,000. Even if you didn't grow up in the church, if you haven't been around the church a whole lot, you probably have some sort of inkling of what this is about and this story. And one of the things we can say about it right off the bat that tells us a couple of things is this is one of the handful of stories that actually shows up in all four Gospels. And that tells us a couple of things. Number one, it tells us that this story was central to the Gospel writers, to the early Christians, and their understanding and ways of communicating kind of the who and what of Jesus and his mission. Not the parable of the Good Samaritan, not the prodigal son, those only show up in Luke. Not the parable of the sower where the seed goes out. John leaves that one out. And if you can believe it, not even Christmas. Christmas only shows up in 2 of the Gospels. And yet it's this story that shows up in all 4 that tells us something about how important it was to the Gospel writers, to the early Christians in terms of understanding and communicating Jesus. Second thing it tells us that might be a little bit more practical is that we hear this story a lot in the church. Because it shows up in all 4 Gospels, it means it's in the assigned readings every single year. And so kind of like Christmas and Easter and Pentecost and those other things that we consider kind of the higher festivals of the church, the story about Jesus feeding the 5,000 is one of those we hear over and over again. And so perhaps you've heard this one before. Or maybe you've heard a sermon or two on it, kind of looking at this story, examining it through a particular lens. We could see in this story an example of Jesus' divinity, his authority over nature, and kind of marvel at how he could possibly take just 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish, multiply it, and feed a crowd of thousands. Or we could kind of see in the story, we could look at it through the lens of history, remember other kind of miraculous feedings in desert places, kind of like the manna in the wilderness in the Old Testament, and see in Jesus the fulfillment of these promises. Or we could take a look at this story and kind of see in it an example of how God works in Jesus, that God works through his disciples, through his servants, through people like you and me today. And all those are good and right and true. But as I've been sitting with this story again this week, there's one word that keeps kind of rattling through my mind, and it's one word that I want you to take with you today. Inexhaustible. Inexhaustible. You see, in the story, we get a glimpse of the seemingly inexhaustible need of humanity. We see sick people, we see lost people, we see hungry people, people like you and like me, all coming to Jesus and bringing their lack, bringing their need to him and saying, do something about this. And then we see Jesus responding to this mass of needy people with an inexhaustible compassion, with a love and a care of God that knows no limits, no boundaries, that overwhelms all of the needs that are brought to him. And so among everything else we could say about this story, in this story we get a glimpse of the inexhaustible love and compassion and care of our God for you and for me and for all people. So let's dive in. If you've got a Bible with you, go ahead and pull that out. If you've got one of our Bibles, you can grab that too. It is on page 820, Matthew chapter 14. If you got a phone with you, that works as well. Feel free to pull that out. If you're comfortable navigating that way, go ahead and do that. Matthew chapter 14. We're going to pick up with verse 13. And it says this. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. And we'll pause there for just a minute. Whenever you're reading the Bible, a couple of really good questions to ask are, where are we and how did we get here? In other words, what's the context? What's going on in this story that can help us understand what's about to come next? And so in this case, we were kind of asked the question, what is it that Jesus heard that prompted him to get in a boat and to get out of town? And so to do that, we start backing up and we start reading backwards through the text, looking at what came before. And we see two particular things that come before. Number one, we see the story of where King Herod killed John the Baptist. Now what you need to know about this is John was Jesus' cousin. John was the forerunner to the Messiah. He was the one to tell Israel that this Jesus was actually the one promised all throughout history, the one who would save his people from their sins. The ministry and the message of John and Jesus were like this. They were intertwined and connected together. And so perhaps Jesus was rightfully worried that if Herod had killed John, he was going to be next. And it wasn't his time yet. And so he got out of town. And if we keep reading backwards, we'll see that just before that, Jesus went back to his hometown. Kind of a common thing, especially for college students. You go back for Thanksgiving or Christmas break or summer, you kind of go back home. And what usually happens, you get a nice welcome, your family comes around, your friends, you see your friends from high school. Well, that's not exactly how it went for Jesus. When he went to his hometown, they rejected him. They kind of said, you're crazy, you're not the Messiah, you're not special, we know you. And they ran him out of town. So suffice it to say, it hasn't been a very good couple of chapters for Jesus. And so understandably, he decides to withdraw from the crowds, to go to this lonely place, to be by himself. In human terms, he is completely and utterly exhausted. And so we read on. It says, when the crowds heard of it, when the crowds heard that Jesus had left, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. Now pause for a minute. Don't keep reading. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Jesus for just a moment and imagine what your response would be. How would that sentence finish if this story were about you? The night out just got ruined. The vacation was just interrupted. Everything and everyone that you had been trying to get away from has followed you, and now they're there in front of you demanding that you do something for them. They're pinging your phone, they're tugging on your sleeve, they're bringing all of their needs to you, but you're exhausted. You just wanted to get away. If you were Jesus, how would you respond? Would you be annoyed? Would you be frazzled? Would you kind of buckle down? Would you joylessly go about your duty? Would you be exasperated and lose your patience? I don't know how you'd respond, but I know for me, if I were in the shoes of Jesus and this were a story about me, the next sentence would not say, and he had compassion on this great crowd. It would say something else. But thankfully, this story isn't about me, and it's not about you. This is a story about Jesus, about the inexhaustible compassion of our God, a compassion that in many ways we've come to expect and to count on and maybe even take for granted. And while we don't ever want to forget it entirely, we don't want to just thanklessly receive God's blessing, I suppose that's not the worst thing in the world. Because there's an aspect, there's a side of trust and faith that counts on something so much, it just assumes that's the way it is. We assume Jesus is going to be compassionate, that Jesus is going to bless this crowd and provide for their needs. That's the way these stories go. But to imagine just for a minute that it could have been otherwise, to put ourselves in the shoes of Jesus and say, what would kind of a normal human response that we might call it, what would that be? Puts a highlight on just how unique and how extraordinary the compassion of Jesus is. In the New Testament, this word compassion, it's only ever used of Jesus. It's unique to him. And so Jesus has compassion on the crowds that other passages tell us were lost, wandering, like sheep without a shepherd. He has compassion on the blind and the sick and the hungry, and so he restores their sight and he restores their health and he feeds them. He's the master in the parable who has compassion and forgives the servant who owes a debt that he could never possibly repay. He's the good Samaritan who has compassion on the man who is robbed and beaten and left for dead and rescues him. And this compassion, this kind of in your guts type of deep sympathy and pity and love, it is one of the hallmarks of the love of God, and yet it's not just a sentimental feeling. It's not just a compassion that says, that must be really hard for you. No, the compassion of Jesus prompts him to act, to teach, to heal, to provide for the needs of those in front of him. The compassion of Jesus always moves him towards those in need, always does good on behalf of needy people like you and like me. And so we pick up with verse 15. It says, "Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and to buy food for themselves.' But Jesus said, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish.' And he said to them, 'Bring them here to me.'" At this point, it's been a long day. We already talked about how Jesus was exhausted. He wanted some time away, and yet the crowds meet him there on the shore. And so instead, he spent the day teaching and healing, exhibiting this inexhaustible compassion to these crowds. And the disciples, presumably, were right there alongside him, doing whatever it was the disciples did while Jesus was doing his thing. But now they've noticed the sun's getting real low, and the crowd's still real big. And so they start to look around a little bit, and they realize they don't have enough to care for this crowd. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough manpower. They don't have enough compassion, really, enough energy to keep going. And it seems like the need of this crowd will never fully be met. Now, anyone who works, whether it's paid or unpaid, anyone who works caring for people, you get this. Because there's always going to be another sick person. There's always going to be another person in need of care or counseling. There's always going to be another hungry person, because I'm sure you've noticed by now, even if you've fed someone 1,000 times, they're going to get hungry again. Parents, you know what this is like. Whether your kiddos are really young, infants still in your arms, or teenagers, they're going to be hungry again. They're going to need to be fed again. Human need is seemingly inexhaustible. And so the disciples' response here isn't entirely unreasonable. They say, "Jesus, there's no way we can meet the needs of this crowd. And so send them away and let them care for themselves. The crowd will be cared for. The local economy will be boosted. The disciples will be able to preserve a little bit of what they have and finally get a break after a long day. It's a win-win-win." And in the face of inexhaustible human need and limited supply, oftentimes we say, well, that's the best answer. Or at least maybe it's the best that we can do. To give people the means, the tools, to kind of take care of themselves. And yet Jesus has another plan. Earlier, at the beginning of the story, Jesus withdrew from the crowds to be by himself. But now that his compassion has been stirred up, he refuses to send them away. And in the face of this seemingly inexhaustible need, Jesus tells the disciples what is perhaps the best possible instruction for anyone with their own needs or caring for the needs of others. And it's as straightforward as it is simple. He says, "Bring them here to me." Now, in the immediate context, Jesus is talking about the fish and the bread. He says, bring the food to me. But at a deeper level, couldn't Jesus be talking about the crowds? Don't send them away. Don't make them go. Bring them here. Bring them to me, and I will meet their need. You see, the inexhaustible compassion, the inexhaustible love of our God is not simply satisfied with meeting human need in kind of this transaction, arm's length sort of way. But the love of God desires to be with and near his people, to be constantly moving closer. It's who he is. Emmanuel, God with us. And one of the major themes of the Bible is this theme of God drawing near and being with his people. It's how the story began in Genesis when God walked in the cool of the evening with Adam and Eve. It's how the story ends at the new creation when God comes down to dwell once again with his people. And in this in-between time, when there's this gulf, this gap of sin that separates God and his people, God is always moving one step closer to draw his people back to him so that they need not go away. He sends prophets, and he topples kingdoms. He moves mountains, and he splits the sea. He endures death, even death on a cross, so that you and I need not go away. In the face of need that seems inexhaustible, it seems like it can never be met. Our own need, the needs of those around us, in the face of the need of this separation, this gap between us and God that it seems no one could possibly bridge, Jesus says, bring them here. Bring them to me. And we see the result beginning with verse 19. Then Jesus ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and all ate and were satisfied. I've often wondered exactly how this miracle happened. You know, was Jesus just kind of sitting there on the grass? He's got the 5 loaves and the 2 fish around him, and then he kind of starts, just breaking off pieces. And he gives some to Peter, and he gives some to John, and he gives some to Andrew. But no matter how many pieces he breaks off, the loaf stays the same size, and it just keeps going endless, on and on and on. Kind of like a story in the Old Testament where Elijah was with this widow, and there wasn't enough food to go around, just enough for one more loaf, and yet every day she goes back to the pantry, and there's flour there, and there's oil there, and that goes on for years, just enough for that next day, a literally daily bread. Or I suppose another way it could have happened is, Jesus says his table prayer, come Lord Jesus, and then all of a sudden the loaves just multiply. Instead of 5 loaves, you get a couple thousand, just all at once. Any Harry Potter fans out there? We've got a few willing to admit it at least. It makes me think there's a spell in Harry Potter where you can make something as soon as it's touched, it just kind of multiplies over and over and over and over and over again. Not that Jesus did magic, we're not going there, but this idea of all of a sudden just there it all was, all at once. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder how did Jesus do this? And yet, truthfully, that's the wrong question. This story isn't inviting us to ask how, to try to pick it apart and come up with some scientific explanation or sociological explanation or anything like that. But instead, it's inviting us to ask the question, who? Who is this Jesus? Is he just a man of extraordinary compassion with some special gifts, able to heal and to multiply food? I think part of the reason the story's in the gospel so much is it gives us this glimpse of who Jesus is. And for the people there that day, and for the gospel writers, and for the early Christians, and for, by extension, you and me, it's a reminder back to all of those other stories. These miraculous feedings in the wilderness, where there was a great crowd and a great need, and God showed up. Except this time, here he is in the flesh, providing for his people. The inexhaustible need of humanity met by the inexhaustible compassion and the limitless supply of our God. It reveals the kind of God he is, who supplies our need for provision, yes, our need for love, our need for forgiveness, who meets all of these needs and overwhelms them with his abundant love and mercy and provision. Overwhelms them so much that there's some left over, more than enough to go around. And so whatever your need is today, bring it here. Bring it to Jesus. Because after all, his compassion for you is inexhaustible. Amen.